Hello, hello, and welcome to Two Black Church Boys Churched and Changed. My name is Calvin Bell III, and I'm here with my co-host William Lee. As you can see, we're not in the same place because William took a trip down to Washington, D.C. It seemed like we'd switch places because I was in Virginia the other week. So how are you enjoying D.C., my favorite city? How are you enjoying it?
I did not know DC was your favorite city.
Yes, it is.
That's good to know. But two, I am immensely enjoying it, actually. I'm having a great time.
That is great to know.
Here. I will be back in town tomorrow, so y'all don't have to worry about that. I will be back. But other than that, man, how are you, Calvin?
I'm doing well. Tired as usual, but prevailing, trying to keep everything together. But I'm doing very well. And I hope all our viewers are doing well. As those that are already on or those that are joining, we thank you for being a part of this.
Yeah. Before we get started, just a quick caveat. Last week we premiered a video. We weren't live. But from here on out, as long as we possibly can, we will be live and in living color for you all. And so tonight, as many of you seen earlier, what we're going to be discussing is the idea of defunding the police. And just at the offset, defunding the police takes on a variety of shapes, forms, and fashions. It is a catch-all term, from everything for moderately reducing the police department to completely abolishing police in its entirety. But basically, at a core level, what defunding the police actually is reallocating money from the militarization and funding of police forces to non-armed programs and services that can be used to offshoot what the police are currently doing. Just some few statistics for you all, just to kind of ground the conversation tonight. Across this country, we spend over $100 billion each and every year on policing. New York City spends $6 billion alone on policing, which is almost more than any other service. The city of Chicago spends $1.8 billion on policing each year, which is double what they spend on the Department of Education for the city. Camden City spent in 2019 $68.45 million on policing, which is almost more than any other municipality save Newark. For instance, Patterson, a city in North Jersey that has double the population that we do in Camden, spent half as much in 2019 on policing. But I'll go into the Camden whole situation a little later. I have a personal opinion about Camden, since it's near and dear to my heart. But I just want to turn it over to Calvin, see what his initial thoughts are about on defunding the police. But before we do that, as always, this is an open conversation. This is a dialogue. This isn't just me and Calvin talking to y'all, but we want you to join in, give us your commentary, give us your thoughts.
Right. And we also appreciate those viewers that are on the Zoom as well. And if you guys have questions, please make sure that you ask them throughout, and we'll hope to get to them as we go along in the process. But my take on the situation when it comes to defunding the police, I really think that it's important to invest in Black communities, whether it's in the sectors of businesses, education, the health sector, and it goes even further than that. But it's making sure that we can build up the wealth for Black communities, ensuring that we can build up a form of equity that I think is not there in terms of putting urban communities on the same level of these Levitt towns, these suburban communities that were built out of urban communities. When you talk about white flight and people leaving places such as Camden, New Jersey. And so, in my opinion, police officers are paid way too much. Police stations themselves are paid way too much. And in terms of, just to give you an image of it, have you seen the development of cars and how these the police cars that we are used to seeing have improved giving people SUVs and everything like that, Escalades, these big cars that don't even look like cop cars anymore. That's where our money, the money that taxpayer money and everything like that, that's where that is going into. And I think that money should be invested into urban communities, Black communities, where there are huge disparities when you look at statistics in terms of helping those communities. We need to make sure that we invest in ourselves. And so that is something that I really hope that we call for during this time, that the short-term process will ultimately lead to a long-term gain. And I really think that that's my perspective in terms of defunding the police.
I guess so. My question is, where do you fall on the spectrum from just moderately reforming police to full out abolishing police departments? For me personally, I think that there are very little uses for police outside of combating violent crime. But the bulk of what police officers do doesn't really have much to do with violent crime. So, for instance, 1 in 4 interactions with the police are related to mental health issues. I don't think that the police should have anything to do with mental health issues. I think a better resource would be to fund those people who are equipped to handle mental health issues and to have them come out into the communities and de-escalate mental health concerns. I think that the police shouldn't be in the business of doing that. Just another statistic for you, 10 million arrests every year are made for non-violent offenses, drug offenses, traffic offenses, just all types of other types of offenses. And I think that as an offshoot of this conversation, we have to also talk about abolishing prisons versus abolishing drug offenses, and decriminalizing drug abuse and usage. But we can talk about that a little later tonight. But I think that for me, where I stand on this whole issue is, what saved the exception of policing violent crime and violent offenders, I don't see any need in 2020 for a police department. But I don't know where you stand on that.
Yeah, so my initial reaction to that is, then I agree that there is too much power that police officers, police stations have in themselves. But then you also go back to what's the inverse of that. If we get rid of them, who is defending us citizens when it comes to violence and everything like that? Because we see what might have happened in terms of George Zimmerman, and how he was not a police officer, he was a neighborhood watch or something like that, and how that turned into the inverse of the killing of Trayvon Martin. And so where do we win in terms of who's defending us? If we do get rid of police officers, like I said, I think they have way too much power in terms of that. I also think that it's a unique point when you're talking about getting rid of prisons, because I think prisons have been around so long that now the educational system is emulating that of a prison system. And so the way in which we're not giving resources to those that are incarcerated, including my father, who is incarcerated right now, how he went through that, and looking at the process of not giving people aid in terms of mental health, helping them in terms of educational opportunities, helping them when it comes to getting out of prison, and then going and trying to re-immerse themselves into society. How do they find jobs? How do they find a living wage to keep their selves up? I think those are issues that there's so many uncertainties, and I just don't know in what direction, where do you start? Because I definitely think that is what the idea that you bring up is more of a long-term thing, but what is the short term in order to get to there? And then once we get there, then what are the alternatives when you talk about police? And what do you think?
Okay, so I see it as a three-headed monster, right? So, in my opinion, the end goal should be complete abolition of police and prisons. And then the third head of that monster is the war on drugs. So in terms of how do we start and how do we arrive at the end, first we have to deal with the policing of nonviolent crimes and nonviolent offenses, right? So for me, that means first decriminalizing and legalizing all drug use. I know that may be a radical idea. We're on a Christian platform, say no to drugs, praise God, all of that. But I think that for too long, we as a country have criminalized things that are not criminal in nature, but they're rather addictive. So we've criminalized addictive behavior, but I think that there are other ways to combat addictive behavior, right? There's rehabilitation, but our criminal justice system is not rehabilitative. It's for punishment. And, so I don't think that that's the best space for that. So I think that one, if we start by decriminalizing, legalizing all drug usage, and we funnel the resources that we put into criminalizing drugs into rehabilitation, into treatment, into helping people who have those type of issues, that's a first step in that direction. Two, like I said, I think that we can begin by defunding the police's mental health services. I think that we can funnel that money into mental health professionals who can go out into the street and deal with people who have mental health problems. I think that three, we need to instantaneously demilitarize the police. There's no reason why a city like Camden, which is 9 square miles, why does Camden have military tanks? Why does it have army equipment? Why does Camden have stockpiles of bombs and weaponry? Like that to me is absolutely asinine. For a city that doesn't even have 80,000 people to have the amount of tanks and equipment that our city has. So I think that we start there, and then slowly but surely, what we have to do is reimagine how to deal with people who break social contract, right? So in law school, we're taught about all of these theories of punishment and all of these theories of dealing with crime, right? And so the ideal of prison is that prison is supposed to be rehabilitative. It's supposed to be for punishment's sake. It's supposed to be deterring either the person from doing the crime again or deterring society from engaging in those types of crimes by punishing the individual that does it. The reality, though, is that prisons do none of those things because at two times, one, our communities are over-policed and under-policed, right? So they're over-policed in terms of non-violent offenses, but they're under-policed in terms of violent offenses. So you're not actually deterring violence, but you're policing everyday behavior and addictive patterns. So I think that in the long term, we have to reimagine how we see prison, reimagine how we see those who break the social contract of engaging with community, and how we reform them and bring them back into community.
Right. So I guess there's a twofold to this. In terms of mental health services and making sure that people get those services, it's also the willingness of the community to go and get therapy and really work on their mental health, because I think that there's a resistance for Black people to really deal with the mental enslavement that we went through. And that's passed down from one person to the next. So we learn about the history, but I think we carry all that burden onto our shoulders. I know I did in school. So it's really the willingness for us to do so when those services are offered, because that it goes back and forth. When they're offered, are we going to be the ones to take advantage of that? The second one is, I guess, an idea that I'll put out in the air. Maybe you can give your thoughts on it. But as we evolve in society, we see the reliance of technology even more. So now you're talking about let's get rid of human beings to do these types of things, such as policing, making decisions and everything like that. So now what if that is replaced with artificial intelligence, which has really come up as of recently when you talk about algorithmic bias and how technology has been making decisions, or people are trying to test out technology to make the decisions, a computer to make the decision of a person. You even see some of the movies, RoboCop and everything like that, where these robots are now emulating the job of a police officer. So what's the idea of that now in terms of getting rid of human beings to do those jobs and now put technology in place with that?
I think that's a way to, that's an interesting theory. I think that the problem though is that once you insert and impute bias, I mean, I know the other study said that you can impute bias into AI, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's an issue that we're confronting in the legal field, where even though you have AI performing legal work, it's still operating with the same biases as the creators. So if you theoretically were to use AI that's that's completely free and divorced from bias, I may be for that. I think still though the other issue though is that we're still policing. We're just changing the machinations of the policing, right? From the people to the robots or the machinery, right? So for me, as somebody who wants to see abolition, ultimately, and I think this goes to Daedre in the comments, said that people go back to jail on purpose. I believe people go back to jail on purpose in part because they utilize jail and prison for services that jail and prison shouldn't provide, right? So I know a lot of homeless people in Camden who intentionally get locked up in the wintertime because they have nowhere to live. So now they're going to prison or jail to provide housing, to provide food, to provide clothing, to provide, health care. And these are all things that our prisons are woefully unable to provide, right? So for me, what I would like to see is rather than AI just solely replace police officers, is how can we use technology in a way that demilitarizes police, but also kind of gets us to a place where we're operating with a sense of racial equity.
Right. And the hard part about limiting algorithmic bias is that the people who are creating it are biased in themselves as human beings. We all carry our own form of bias, whether it's intentional or not. And so that is also the troubling thing as well. And I think that in terms of just the communication between human beings, education is definitely something that is going to be important if you move on to something as extreme or as different as abolishing the police as a whole, because it's something that we weren't used to in our framework. And I think that also just looking back at the history of policing in itself, I think it's lost its messaging in terms of what it needs to be doing, what its meaning is behind it. However, I definitely think that technology is something that can influence it in a positive way. However, technology itself has its own bias because human beings are the ones that are creating it.
That's real. I mean, I agree with all of that. I think I keep going back to this like reimagining language, right? Like you talk about education, but I think that we have to reimagine what it means to be people that exist in society with each other, right? We have to rethink about what it means for me and you to coexist in community and neighborhood and tandem with one another and what that means. And if we're not going to have prisons and if we're not going to have police, what does it mean for us to exist in social contract? And what happens if one of us breaks the social contract? How does the community punish, and I don't like using the language punish, but how does the community punish / restore someone when they break the social contract under this reimagined sense of community without policing, without prison? There's a model in High Point, North Carolina, where instead of taking drug dealers to prison, they present them to like a community tribunal. And what that community tribunal does is they say, listen, you are destroying our community. You are not helping to build up the fabric of our society by selling drugs in this community. We don't want to see you not a part of the community though, just because you're doing this. So allow us to help you figure out a different way to make money. Allow us to help you rehabilitate and rebuild yourself. And I think it's something that you spoke to earlier, is that a lot of times we don't embrace therapy, we don't embrace different systems, we don't embrace different patterns of thought because we haven't been exposed to different patterns of thought, right? Everything that we've been exposed to is you break a crime, here comes the cops, we lock yourself up. Excuse me, I almost slipped.
Okay.
Lock yourself up until we think that you are rehabilitated. You may or may not be rehabilitated. Then we kick you back out into the community for you to do the same thing over and over again. But I think if we're going to really move the needle in this new movement and this new zeitgeist, right, we have to reimagine as Black people in particular, right, what does it mean for us to, quote unquote, police ourselves? What does it mean for us to deal with those who break the trust of the community? How do we be restorative and rebuild them rather than tear them down?
Right. And I think that before trying that on a universal level, maybe to utilize that in places like schools, for example. When you talk about students of color being suspended from school because maybe they misbehave or something like that, that's instantly the first thing that people go to. But I know that and in certain sectors, especially in the private school sector, there are privileges in terms of creating committees where the students either make the decision on what the punishment should be for the student, to really hear them out, to have the perspective of a student and not being from the perspective of the enforcer, but then to also help the student out. And it could be things such as just community service or giving back to the school in some format or some way. But trying that out or in a area or a place like that and observing it and to see how it works, and then maybe slowly moving it into a more universal level, because I think the idea is we want fast change. However, people have to get used to these new systems. And I see someone say it doesn't work in elementary schools, which is correct. I don't think that we should try it out in elementary schools whatsoever. I'm talking about more on a high school level, where this is where you have kids who are in a more mature environment, understanding the world a little bit better, and maybe you decide who's on it. Maybe it's some students who are more veteran in certain areas. Maybe it's student leaders in the community. Maybe it's students who talk to the students themselves. But definitely not in a middle school, even an elementary school area, because I don't think that those students have the maturity level right now. It's more so at that age, it's like, oh, someone hit me, so that's a bad doing. But what was the reason for that? It's, but I think at a high school level, maybe observing it, and then even on a college level to see how that works out in certain communities, in certain areas, because I think that allows you to have students who are from the community to help the student who may have done something that was not seen as valuable to the community. In the same way that you just said, William, where someone is doing something in a broader community, like a statewide community, and then the community members, more veteran community members, are helping someone.
Oh, for sure. I'm reading a comment about cops are called, and I was going to lift up a statistic. There are approximately 3 million students in schools of police who don't have nurses. There are 1.7 million students in schools of police who don't have guidance counselors. So that speaks a lot about where our money is. I saw someone say that community's value is placed and it's built off of where you spend your money. And for the bulk of our communities, where the money goes is towards policing. So we don't commoditize, we don't value education, we don't value community health, we don't value transportation and infrastructure. We value punishing people and over-policing Black and brown bodies. That's what our funding says that we value. And even in our schools, we don't value educating and training our children. We value punishing them and keeping them in line and keeping them in order. I think that while you may not be able to implement the ideal in the full capacity that you're talking about. I do think that K-8 kids have a capacity to know right from wrong.
Right.
I think that they should be able to have some kind of ability and say in their own communities as to what is right versus what is wrong, and how to deal with someone who breaks the bounds of that community, right?
And we have an interesting comment of peer mediation. I recall that being something that we had in middle school, where we students were chosen to be peer mediators to really, if you saw like a discussion between two different students, you would have the steps to de-escalate that situation, and to help those students move forward. So you would talk to one student and then you would talk to the other student, get both sides of the situation and help them fix that. Or so I think that is an interesting point, that peer mediation definitely can be utilized through K-8 schooling, because like you said, William, children do understand right from wrong. If you know that hitting is not right, then you obviously know right from wrong and different things like that.
For sure. And I think that we can't underestimate our young ones' capacity for understanding right from wrong. I think that what we're talking about really is, and ultimately what this whole movement about at this level is, reimagining how we engage with one another, reimagining how we exist in society, right? Where it's moved from racialized existence to really seeing each other as equals, really seeing each other as collaborators in creating a better world for each other. I know I wanted to close on discussing Camden in particular, because Camden is a hotbed for police reform right now. It's getting a lot of nationalized attention around what has happened here. And I have my own opinions about it, seeing as I was on the ground organizing in 2013 when the police department was disbanded. But before I express that, I wanted to kind of hear from you, Calvin, as someone who frequently, travels into the city. What is your opinion on the current policing in Camden, and would you uplift that as a model for police reform?
Right. So I did my senior capstone projects, William knows about it, on community engagement in the city of Camden and its influence on the rates of violence. So I was more of a new learner in terms of the history and everything like that, whereas William has been around and been on the grounds and really doing more work in that sector. So I'm getting more involved in it in that framework. But my initial reaction, Kamau Brown, also Kamau Bell did a coverage on the city of Camden. United Shades of America, check it out. It was an episode on CNN. And it really covered specifically this situation. And I think one of the things that they brought up, especially, was the way in which the police officers you have people coming from different communities, going to the academy and then coming into the city. So that was one of my biggest issues when it comes to people understanding the communities that they're in. And I think that the one area that I appreciate, at least, and I don't even know if that is even valuable in itself, is that those police officers have to go through training in which they interact with the community members. If you've seen it, and I've seen it in the past few years, you see like two police officers patrolling the streets together. And that's something that's very interesting to me, because on one side, I appreciate that maybe it's a part of their training to interact with the people, really get to know them. But at the same time, to have that force, to have that that feeling like someone is breathing down your neck and constantly patrolling your life from morning to night, is something that's also very daunting, because you know that no matter what, you're still going to have less power than them in any circumstance or in any framework that you do it. What William brought up with this national attention and everything like that, at first I was more so hoorah, yay, like Camden, people are shining light on everything that's going on, that the protests were peaceful. Don't get me wrong, the protests have been peaceful in Camden, instead of other places. And William has a different viewpoint on that as well, on whether peace is good in these circumstances. So I was very hoorah about that. But I think that also media attention cannot cloud the issues within the society itself. We still have issues within the city that are really being covered up. And it's in terms of, why aren't we talking about those issues to also fix them? I don't like when people put Camden on the map to say, oh, Camden was the most violent city and blah, blah, blah. And then now it's the inverse of, oh, Camden has been very peaceful, blah, blah, blah. It's the lost narrative, and we're changing the narrative, but we're not honestly going back to the history.
Yeah. Looks like Calvin may have frozen there towards the end of what he was saying. What I will say, from being around in 2013 and working on the ground when we were organizing, it was not the rosy picture that has been painted in the national media circuits. So just give you all a quick primer on what happened. We were faced with what they like to call austerity measures, right? Where Christie was trying to, Governor Christie at the time, was trying to make mass budget cuts across the state. And Camden's police system at the time had a very robust union system that paid a very nice pension. And so a part of disbanding the police department was to not have to pay out those pension payments anymore. They used the quote unquote crime statistics, which are always manipulated, as an aside. As a political science major, you'll figure this out very soon, Calvin, that Adolph Reed said, "It's a special place in hell for statisticians and political scientists." And when you ascertain crime based on square mileage, you'll see what they mean. But anyway, so they manipulated crime statistics in Camden to justify reducing the police budget by disbanding the police. And what they did was they disbanded the police and they created this metropolitan force, which paid the cops less money than the old force, and got rid of the pension program for a 401k program. They hired back a good number of the cops that they got rid of, but then they brought in cops, as Calvin was saying, from out of town. What happened in the immediate years that followed this rebranding and this rebuilding of the Camden, the police department, into this metropolitan force, is that use of excessive force complaints skyrocketed 800% in the city of Camden. These cops employed what we call broken windows techniques, which are techniques where you pull someone over for a very, very minor offense in the hopes of finding a larger offense. And the idea is that if you're over policing in this way, with the increased police presence, you're actually going to deter violent crime from happening. All of this came to a boil in 2014, where there was a young brother in East Camden, I believe, that was placed in a chokehold, very similar to what happened to George Floyd. The brother survived, thank God. So the then police chief, oh my gosh, names are not there. I can't think of his name. I actually know him personally. They made a number of reforms. They became more intentional about engaging with the community. And so I think that where the police department is now in Camden is much better than what it was in 2013. But a lot of the mistrust from what happened between breaking down the old force and how that went about, how that was politicized, and how the community didn't get a say in that, into how the force is now, to the whole lack of Camden residents on the force, being policed by white men in particular from outside of the city. There's still a lot of mistrust there. And I know as a Camden resident, I still have a lot of mistrust for the police, because I was harassed by the Metro Force on more than one occasion traveling to my aunt's house in Parkside because they were over policing her community and her neighborhood in particular. So I still have vivid experiences dealing with the Metro Police in 2013, 2014 that I, for the sake of my work now, try to move past. But, you know, the wounds are still there. So I think that it's great that on one hand, like Calvin said, Camden is receiving all of this press. But on the other hand, if you're going to receive all of this press, then you have an obligation to tell the truth about what happened in Camden and tell the truth about what happened with the police department. And it wasn't this rosy picture that they're trying to paint. And I certainly don't believe that Camden is in any shape, form, or fashion a model for nationwide defunding, disbanding, revolutionizing police. Like, it's definitely not a model. And
No.
we definitely shouldn't operate as if it is a model. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, and you'll realize that if you go from maybe a different community, and then come into Camden, the nuances when it comes to policing. If I see it leaving from Pennsauken, which is not that far from Camden, to go to Camden, you definitely see the nuances in that. I don't have like policing or police officers patrolling the streets every day. So that is definitely a nuance. And in terms of defunding, being a model of defunding and using that money to give back into the city, it's not there. It's not that big. It's not that drastic. I know New York just deducted $1 million so far from the Camden police, not the Camden, New York police station. So in terms of the issues still that Camden is going through, when you're talking about education, and how schools are being broken down, and now they're trying to rebuild up these new schools. Camden High School, for example, what is going to happen to it? Is it going to turn into charter school or everything like that? You have these public and charter school situations. Right now, people need jobs during this time. A lot of people have lost wages, lost jobs due to this pandemic. So there are so many issues that we still, the residents of Camden still have to deal with right now, in terms of trying to live their lives.
Yeah. I noticed a comment about understanding the origins of policing and how it goes back to slavery. Um, and that's what we're talking about, all in all, about reimagining community, reimagining the ideal of policing and prisons and criminalization and the things that we quote unquote criminalize, right? Is because a lot of these origins of these institutions come out of slavery, white supremacy, and post-slavery Reconstruction practices. For those who may not be aware, the origins of American policing actually come out of the slave patrols, right?
Right.
So during slavery, there were these patrols of white men who went around looking for slaves who left their plantations or were seeking freedom to return them back to slavery. And out of that, and out of Reconstruction and these groups of people, these quote unquote vigilantes who were trying to restore order in communities, which is ironic given that the vigilantes are the ones who were disturbing the communities. That's how we get the modern day policing that we have, right? I posted something on Facebook about how in Missouri they had like a nigger patrol, and they had literal flyers asking people to join what they called the nigger patrol. And out of that comes policing. But what we're talking about today is how do we reimagine community, right? How do we take the energy from movement for Black Lives, from Black Lives Matter, and this conversation about defunding the police to a more strategic conversation about how do we reimagine our communities? How do we reimagine how our communities are formed? And how do we heal our communities? Calvin, you hit it on the head with the whole therapy piece. We are a community of people who have been traumatized from slavery, Reconstruction, Jim Crow, New Jim Crow, to where we are now. Like, we are a traumatic people, and we need therapy. We need healing. We need spiritual healing, emotional healing, physical healing. And so this whole conversation really, I keep talking about reimagining and reinvigorating, but it's like, how do we heal from the pain that has been inflicted on us and the pain that we inflict on each other? And part of that is reimagine it in the light of racism and this energy around being anti-racist, how we see each other in community.
Right. I think that as a society, we've lost that those ideals of like love and just seeing each other as on a more human level. that we all kind of breathe the same air, that we walk on the same ground, those types of ideals. And we use our identities to separate us. And although we should embrace those identities because they're our makeup, it's definitely something that in order to get to that place of feeling like everyone is accepted, in order to get to that place where people are like, when are these protests going to end and everything like that? Well, these protests are going to end. These issues will end ultimately when we get to a place of just pure respect and intentionality and sympathy and empathy, especially empathy for one another, to see each other on a more human level.
That's real. So, in short, what started out tonight as supposed to be a conversation just about defunding the police kind of morphed into a conversation about community and shared values, how we live together, how we understand one another, and how we focus on building our community up again. Unless you have anything to say in closing, I was getting ready to wrap up.
No, I just thank everyone for joining us today. Definitely, we appreciate our viewers, our constant viewers, and those that have just joined and heard the conversation as we continue on in the process of everything that we're doing, that we hope that you would just continue to join us, be a part of the conversation, and just listen to what we have to say, but also know that this is a platform for all of you as well.
Yeah. And we encourage and we're appreciative of everybody who engaged in dialogue, and we encourage all of you. We have people watching on the Zoom, people who are peeking in and out of the Facebook groups. Just, engage with us, talk with us. We'll do our best to respond to your commentary and your questions. By way of announcements, Calvin and I were not present last week because we were a part of what's called the Colorcast podcasting networks.
Yeah.
Meet and greet. So we announced a couple weeks ago that we made it to phase 2. And what's so innovative about what Colorcast is doing is they are premiering a slate of black and brown, I should say, podcasters on a whole network. And so if selected, we will be a part of the first iteration of black and brown podcasters to be featured on a national platform. And so we are engaging with the founders of Colorcast. We have a conversation with them scheduled for next week. So we solicit your prayers, your positive vibes, your thoughts as we continue with that process. I just wanted to appeal, if there's anything that you want us to talk about on here, let me or Calvin know. Reach out to us,
right.
Just in our DMs. We'll be glad to have that conversation. We'll be glad to think about it. We have these next few weeks already planned out. We have some guests coming in next week and the week after to talk about voter suppression. We're going to have a conversation about reclaiming Africanism in the Bible in a couple of weeks. So we're really excited about that. But if our hearts and minds are clear, we thank you all for being here with us tonight. And until next time, it's 2 Black Church Boys, and we are out.
Stay church.